We're getting pretty close to the end of the semester. I'm sure that you've definitely noticed that. And unfortunately, because of the ice storm we had earlier in the semester, that kind of packed a few things into the second half of our course that ordinarily would be a little bit more spread out. So I know you're feeling the heat right now. And I guess all I can say is, I sympathize because I've been there before. I know the end of the semester is extremely busy, and it'll be over real soon. We've got this week, and next week is the last week of instruction. So once you get through next week, then things will kind of decompress and cool off a little bit, and you've got more time to think as you prepare for finals. And then when finals are behind you, you've got an entire summer to decompress, hopefully. So the homework assignment 13 is available on Blackboard right now, and also after the project is due on Wednesday, there will be one last cost estimation assignment, homework 14. It's not on the slides, but it's available now on Blackboard if you want to get an early look at that. It's relatively shorter in comparison to homework 13. I guess, what you could say is the assignment that you submitted today, homework 12, requires a little bit more independent thinking than some of the assignments before that. Earlier on in the semester, it was just really about find formula, put number into formula, operate calculator. But hopefully by now you're getting more sophisticated in your ability to think in terms of money, and a little more comfortable with independent problem solving. And you don't get more comfortable with independent problem solving until you try it. And so, it's intentional that the problems are slightly more complex, because believe me, that's an accurate representation of the real world. The real world is profoundly complex, and so a couple of open-ended problems, well, they're not open-ended, but they're not as simple as they used to be. It's not just find an equation and substitute variables in. It's a little bit more problem solving and thinking. So I'll invite you to contact me on Teams if you have a question about the homework. That's the best way for us to connect, is for you to call me on Teams and for us to talk about it live back and forth. That's much superior to email. Email one-sided communication is a terrible way for people to learn from each other. All right, so today we're going to talk about some ideas from chapter 14 in our textbook, Inflation and Present Worth. And I think a lot of these ideas will seem familiar because we've kind of touched on the core essence of the time value of money before, and inflation is a big part of that. Now, take a look at this big, gigantic boat of a car, the 1950 Hudson. And unfortunately, I don't think Hudson is still making vehicles these days. I don't know the story behind that, but if you look at the picture, that is just a gigantic vehicle, and its original sales price was $2,365. And so it's kind of interesting to think what it must have taken to build a vehicle like that. This is before the days of automation. And so that vehicle was assembled by hand. And of course there were tools to assist in the process, but it wasn't AI doing the sorting, and it wasn't robots doing the welding. It was people making the car. And the fact that it's so gigantic suggests that probably there was a lot of raw materials that went into that as well. So it's kind of remarkable that its sales price was so low. What we think of today as being very, very low. And this wasn't just one model that was cheap. If you look through publications at the time, there were quite a lot of options available. Some as cheap as, let's see, $795 for a Dodge pickup. You certainly couldn't get a Dodge pickup for that price now, at least not one that you can expect to turn on. Maybe I'm thinking about vehicles a lot because I just recently sold my old car that I'd kept for a lot of years and have been going through the search process. And if I could get my hands on a 1950 Hudson, I'd be tempted. Fast forward to today, and whereas the 1948 Dodge pickup was $795, and by the way, I think that was used at the time. If you look at some of these other model years, it's clear that the 1948 would have been used. But still, really cheap in comparison to $68,000 for an F-150. And this was back in 2019. I would imagine that prices have just continued to climb since then. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the inevitable progression of price increases, and especially when the supply of money is expanded, like it has been dramatically in the last several years. So why do cars cost so much today? If you think about the labor-saving improvements and computerization and robotic assistance should, in theory, make vehicles cheaper. But of course, the raw materials have gone up. The pay and salary of the employees is higher than it used to be. Electricity costs more. Oil costs more. All of the materials that are used to produce the vehicle are more costly than they used to be. And so, all of that plays a role. This figure illustrates the rate of inflation in the United States from 1775 to the present. And so, this is zoomed out pretty far over a really long time frame. But what I think you'll immediately notice is that in the olden days, before the modern era, prior to World War II, that's to say, there were periods where inflation was negative. And it turns out that negative inflation is a pretty horrible thing. It's very damaging to an economy, and we'll talk more about the details about that later. But the other thing I think you'll notice is that the rate of variation is less than it used to be. In the past, when the money supply wasn't regulated as much as it is now with a central bank, in the past there were these huge swings where one year maybe prices would be increasing by 30%, and this is an annual percent change. So that means, next year something would cost 30% more than this year. And imagine how hard it would be to plan for your business, for your personal spending, budgeting, how difficult it is to plan when things may be 30% more expensive next year. You don't know. Or it could wildly swing the other direction and be 20% less. And so think about how your planning and spending may be different if things are 30% more next year versus if they're going to be 20% less next year. Think about what kind of behavior that maybe would cause you to undertake if you knew things were going to be more expensive in the future versus if they'd be cheaper in the future. Think about how that would make you act. So in more recent years, you can see that inflation is less, and especially if we zoom in on the 80s and onwards, the rate of inflation hasn't gone above 5% for just maybe but a few months since the inflation was whipped in the 80s. Here's a graph zooming in on that section that was just highlighted in yellow a bit. And it's showing that kind of has an interesting relationship between, this is hourly earnings. And the hourly earnings are closely tied to the price of things, because if people are earning more in each paycheck, then they're going to be spending more in each paycheck. And so if there's more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, then prices are going to go up. And especially in the case of COVID, where there are some supply shortages. If you think about that, factories were closed in some cases for weeks or months. And if you think about that, transport was interrupted, so that kind of disrupted global supply chains. And then more recently, there was a lot of news about that freighter which blocked the Suez Canal in Egypt, and how much traffic would normally go through there and was interrupted for more than a week, I believe. So all of that is just to mention that there are supply shortages now and more money than ever before. So it would be reasonable to suspect that there's going to be quite a lot more inflation in the coming years than there has been in the past years. So one of the things illustrated by this figure is that there seems to be price inflation when wage growth occurs. And that's because there's more demand for goods when people have more money. And then there are occasional periods of recession in our economy where people get laid off and where there is less dollars chasing the supply of goods. And so during periods of recession, when there is more supply of labor, then the wages don't have to grow as much. Okay, so what we mean by inflation is the increase. Sometimes people say inflation, but they don't know what's inflating. What's inflating is prices. And so the amount of money needed to obtain the same good or service is inflating. The rate of inflation is when we represent that on an annual basis as a percentage of the currency's previous value. Now, here's the thing that you have to be careful about because of inflation, is that if your savings account is earning less than the inflation rate, then you have no gain in purchasing power. And so if you have a bank account that's only earning 0.5% per year, and you put $100 into that bank account, and meanwhile prices are going up at 3% per year, then what it means is 1 year from now you will have more dollars. The number of dollars will be higher than it was before, but the price of goods will have risen even faster than the number of dollars raised in your account. So we talk about that as purchasing power, as can you buy more things in the future than you can now? If so, that means your purchasing power has gone up. So we're going to differentiate between simply having more dollars in the future and, more importantly, having the ability to buy more things in the future. That's truly the reward for investment, is that your deferred gratification means that you can get more in the future than you could today. So the real interest rate takes these two factors into account. The real interest rate takes into account the rate at which your bank may be paying interest, which is called the market interest rate. And the real interest rate also takes into account the inflation rate. So it represents the gain in purchasing power. Now, I mentioned this phrase market interest rate a moment ago. And it's the inflation adjusted interest rate, I sub F, is what the bank is going to, I guess, try and conceal from you, because they don't want it to be clear how much extra interest you would have to make in order to receive an increase in your purchasing power. So there's a formula that relates the market interest rate and the real interest rate. And that formula says that if you know a certain future value and you're going to calculate the present equivalent of that, where you have both inflation, F, and also an increase in purchasing power, then I sub F, which we're going to calculate with this formula, would tell you how much you need to earn in order to cover both the effect of inflation and to receive a real rate of return. So I, again, is the real rate of return. It's the increase in purchasing power. F is the effect of inflation, so it's simply the economy and how much prices are going up over time. And so I sub F takes both of those factors into account. Now, let me explain it this way. Let's say that there's a certain basket of goods, and it could be groceries, it could be raw materials, it could be building construction supplies, but in this case, let's just assume that it's food. And today, if you're going to add up the cost of these items in your basket, then the price is $25. And if we assume that prices are going to go up at a rate of 3% per year, and so remember, F represents the annual percentage increase in prices, so it's the inflation rate. If inflation is 3% per year, then the price in 15 years, we can calculate that with the same kind of 1 plus interest rate to the n power approach as we have before. So remember this formula where before I would put the letter I inside the parentheses when we were using this formula structure with interest rates. We can use this same approach when we're calculating prices. F is some decimal representing a rate, And so we would have 1.03 to the power of 15, and that would allow us to calculate the future price of this basket of goods. And so if we go through and do that, substitute in 0.03 for F, and N is 15, then this basket of groceries that today costs $25, because of the effect of compounding, is going to cost $38.95 in 15 years. So it's 3% growth every year, but it's 3% of the previous year. It's not 3% of the base year. And so what that means, since it's 3% of the previous year, is that there's the compounding effect in the same way that we can expect compound interest when we are putting money into a savings account and leaving those earnings inside of the savings account. All right, so $38.95 is how much this basket of goods will cost in 15 years. But what if you were going to save $25 today? So you're putting it in the bank, and you're, let's say, really fortunate, and you have a bank that pays 7% interest. So how many baskets of food would you be able to purchase in 15 years if your bank is paying more than the inflation rate? So you do have a real rate of return here, because anytime your market interest rate, I sub F, is greater than the inflation rate, that means you have a positive I, that you'll have your real rate of return will be positive, meaning an increase in purchasing power. Okay, so what we do here is we would calculate how many dollars will you have in the account after 15 years. So the same structure of the formula, 1 plus some rate taken to the power of n. So in this case, if the rate of growth is 7%, that means it's 1.07 to the power of 15, and then multiply that by 25. So you'd have $68.98, and if the price was $38.95, then you can buy more baskets of food in the future. So that represents an increase of purchasing power. 25 today would get you one basket, but 25 invested into an account that's earning interest faster than the rate of inflation means you can have more baskets of food in the future. Any questions about that so far? Okay, well, we are going to work through an in-class exercise today where we're going to get some practice using these formulas. Remember that this is the formula that relates the market interest rate, the real rate of return, I, and the inflation rate, F. So we're going to go through the same process of we know what the current price of an item is, and we know what the price inflation will be. So this 4% is F, because F represents the price inflation. In part A, I'd like you to calculate how much will this item cost in 5 years. So similar to the illustration I just showed you. And then if you have to have a real interest rate of 10%, so if this I is 10%, then what is I sub F that should be earned? So we know I, we know F, calculate I sub F. And then lastly, how much money should you invest today to purchase the item in 5 years? The thing to keep in mind is that when you invest money, let me put this clarification here. How much money should you invest today? That is to say, at the I sub F rate that the bank will pay. So I'm just clarifying here that the interest rate you should apply in this part C is the market interest rate to purchase the item in 5 years. Okay, so let me pause for a moment, put you into the breakout group so you can chat with each other and check answers and all of that sort of thing. And then we'll get back together and go over the answer to part 1. If you finish early, you're welcome to start on part 2, but there are a few more things I'm going to ultimately talk about for part 2, so For now, we're just going to go through the first part of the in-class exercise. Okay, so in the in-class exercise, we're going to, for part B, apply this formula. So let's just identify what are the things that we know. Here is the present value of the amount. So this is the number of dollars at time 0. F is 0.04, N is 5, and we want to find out what would be the expected cost after 5 years of price inflation. So let me show you the solution to this. Okay, you can see that I've identified on the page the applicable variables here. So we know F. Later on in part B, we're given I, and it's asking us for I sub F. But in the first part, we're finding the future cost of the item, starting with the present known cost, and then the effect of compounding price increases. And so with the formula, we get that it's going to be $6,083.26 after 5 years of the price increasing by 4% every year. And it's 4% of the previous year, which makes it compounded. Okay, so now in part B, it says that we want to achieve I of 10%, and we're trying to solve for I sub F. And so if you remember back here to the definition of terms, real interest rate is I, inflation rate is F, and then the inflation adjusted interest rate is one way that we describe in language I sub F, and the other is it's called market interest rate. Either of those terms can be used interchangeably for I sub F. And so this is saying what is the inflation adjusted interest rate, so what is I sub F? So here's the formula for that. I sub F is the unknown, I and F are given. And so the solution to that is 14.4%, because you can see that we add together the two components of increasing, and then have to multiply it together because of the, well, where it comes from is this expression where we're simultaneously having the price increasing as we're also earning a real increase in purchasing power, and so it's a cumulative effect. Okay, so 14.4% is, you'd have to go find an account that pays 14.4% if you want your purchasing power to go up by 10% every year. So to buy the item in 5 years, that means that you should invest $3,104.60. Now, look at what I've done. I've put the price that I know it's going to cost as the F. So F is how much we know we're going to have to spend, and the bank itself is paying the market interest rate. So that's what I solved for in part B. So the rate that I'm using is the 14.4% because that is the inflation adjusted interest rate that the bank is paying. And so how much do you have to put into that account? It's going to be less. You know, if you're putting money into the bank now in order to have it accumulate and grow over time, we should expect that it's going to be a fewer number of dollars than the future amount that's desired. And we find that to be the case, that it's $3,104.60. Okay, now the second part of this in-class exercise is about the price increase of an Airbus 380. I don't know if any of you have seen this plane before, but it's just an absolute giant. I had the privilege of flying on an Airbus 380 in 2019. I flew it from Washington, D.C. to Dubai, and boy, it was luxurious. I wasn't in first class or anything like that. I was just in the economy class, but it was still a very pleasant experience. Lots of amenities on a giant plane like that. Plenty of room to spread out. Okay, so let's assume that the purchase price of an Airbus 380 is $340 million. And if we know that the inflation is going to increase its price by 9% every year, then we want to solve for how many years until it costs 500 million. Okay, now you can use the log function on your calculator to solve that problem. So think about what is the structure of this solution. Let me show you the formula that we can substitute it into. Here, the future amount on this example is 500 million. The present amount is 340 million. F is 0.09, and we're solving for n. So n is the unknown. Now there's a couple of different ways you can solve for this. You can iterate, just do trial and error on n, or you can put it into the equation solver of your calculator. And if you don't know how to use an equation solver on your calculator, that's a really important skill. And so they taught it to you in Engineering 111 if you took that class, or maybe taught it to you in Mechanical Engineering 111. But being able to put an equation into a calculator and solve for an unknown is just like a critical task. And so I'll show you in a moment how you can rearrange this equation and use the logarithm function. But essentially, you know F, you know P, you know the inflation rate, lowercase f, solve for n for the conditions that are described here. So let me give you a moment to try and solve that one, and then I'll show you the answer. Okay, let me show you the solution here. Maybe, okay, there we go. So we know that F is 0.09, and the present cost, we want to know how long until it gets to this future cost of 500 million. And so if we want to try and isolate the n, then what we need to do algebraically for that is first of all divide both sides by p, and then once we have this, to get the n out of an exponent, then we can take the log of both sides. And what that does is if you have the log of an exponent, then you can bring the exponent down in front of the log, like is shown here. So the left-hand side would be the log of f divided by p, and then the right-hand side is the n, which was previously an exponent, but then when we took the log of that, it enables us to bring it out in front of the log. So then isolating n algebraically, you can see that in the numerator is going to be the log of the ratio of future to present. So 500 million to 400 million, 340, take the log of that. And then in the denominator, 1.09 with the logarithm function of that. So it's going to be 4.475 years, assuming that this price is going up continuously. So the price every day increases a little bit, and then the effective annual rate of increase is 9%. So that's it for today, everybody. Let's just take one last glance at these announcements. That the next thing that you've got coming up is homework 13, and you're now at the 1 week mark for the project. The project is due on Wednesday the 21st of April, and so I would strongly suggest that you read through the assignment description one last time before finalizing your report, just to make sure that you've got everything in there that I'm asking for. It would be a good investment of your time. Thank you. Hope you have a great day. I'll see you on Friday.